So with that, I am going to introduce our first presenter, Nancy Moody, and she is the Director of Research Integrity. She's going to present on research involving human subjects. Nancy?
Remember that? Yeah.
Hello, I'm happy to be here this afternoon with you. I hear some voices, but we'll continue. So my first slide is the contact information, which really that's what the whole workshop is, to let you see that I'm a friendly person and that you can contact me and you can email. We get many emails and calls. People don't like to figure out the form, which we're happy to let you know what form you should do. So please contact me if you have any questions, you want to talk about your project and the IRBNet software. So I want to point out that human subjects research is both federally regulated, so we have the political regulations, if you will, since 1974, it's been codified into federal regulations, but we've always had ethical standards, and they go all the way back to unconscionable research that was done from probably day one in the medical field all the way through World War II, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And so usually I have a slide here with history, but because of the time, I was unable to really highlight it. But I want you to know that research that was done in America was very unethical after the NUREMBERG Code had established these principles that we have to have volunteer needs to consent, unnecessary suffering, avoidance of any death or disability, and terminate the research if there's harm to the participant. And so that was going on up until the 70s, and then it started getting news from the Tuskegee syphilis study. There was congressional hearings, and that all evolved into 1974, where the Code of Federal Regulations codified the ethical standards and federal regulations on human subjects research. The regulations are only for federally funded research, but again, we have the ethical standards, plus at any institute, you have to have a federal-wide assurance, and the federal-wide assurance says you're going to treat all participants the same. So that's how we are covering federally funded and unfunded or different sources for human subjects research. So here is the National Research Act that created the federal regulations. You've got the slides so you can look at them at your leisure, but it was really a group of experts that was pulled together to make the standards of biomedical and behavioral research, looking at risk and benefit criteria and appropriate guidelines for participation in research and the elements of an informed consent. So let's go back to the basics. What is an institutional review board? So the federal government requires that 5 individuals, and one of which has to be unaffiliated with the institution, has to have some diversity in gender. For us, we are a community IRB, so we have our faculty from the university, but we also have faculty or employees from St. Mary's, Renown Health, and the VA hospital here in Reno. We have one faculty member from the community college, Truckee Meadows, and we have community members that generally are retired, but they're from all sorts of different occupations, from real estate to working for the state with children, disadvantaged children, and we have a retired nurse. So one thing I wanted to lift up is that we're all about the safety of the participant. We're not about the science and the design of your study, other than how it impacts the participant. So these are the things that you should consider when you're filling out your application, is what's the participant's perspective? You know, who are they? How are you going to recruit them? Will there be any undue influence or coercion? Will they understand in advance what you're agreeing to participate in? And could the participant be compromised or embarrassed if the information was leaked out? Any pain, discomfort, needless boredom, embarrassing, offensive, or otherwise stressful, any long-term consequences. So this is really what the board does, is they look at the study from the perspective of the participant, and they're going to mitigate any risk. If you can't mitigate risk, you're going to have full disclosure for transparency on what the participant's risk would be and if there's any benefits. So here's just a visual graph of the Belmont report, which lends itself of the experts coming in and making the ethical guidelines. And so there's three. Respect for persons, which we see in human subjects research as an informed consent document, the capacity to consent, and your recruiting strategy. Beneficence is the do no harm, maximize benefits. So again, think about scales. You want the highest benefit with the lowest risk. Of course, that is not always possible. And so how can you mitigate the risk? Again, if you can't mitigate the risk, you have to disclose and make transparent of what the person's risk might be. The justice is a distributive justice, and so it's looking for equitable selection of subjects. So if you only want males in your study, you have to justify why you cannot have females. If you go after a marginal, vulnerable population, you're going to have to justify and rationalize why the study would only pertain to those individuals. These three ethical principles reflect 2 years of unethical behavior regarding the lack of respect, the increased harm, and poor injustice in marginalized society. Members were the only participants. So the IRB has simple mission: protect the rights and welfare of the individuals participating in the research. The duties are to approve, disapprove, modify, suspend research as necessary to ensure the protection, and authority to exercise final authority with the institution for ensuring adequate protections for the subjects. Officials of the institute may not approve research if it has not been approved by the IRB. So leadership can decide that there's not funding or resources for the research, but they cannot decide that the research doesn't meet the federal regulations. That's the IRB's authority. So the criteria for the IRB approval is risk are minimized, risk are reasonable, selection is equitable of subjects, informed consent, or a waiver of informed consent or a modification, but it has to be requested, that you monitor the data to collect to ensure the safety of the subjects, have adequate protection for the privacy of the subjects, and maintain confidentiality. So that, in a nutshell, is what the litmus paper test is for every application. Is the IRB are looking for those points. So there's 3 layers, if you will, of IRB review. The full board for us is above minimal risk. Minimal risk is never defined in the federal regulations, but generally it's come to be interpreted as risks that are above the normal day-to-day experiences and risk of an individual. And so for us, full board, our drug and device studies, they generally are from the hospitals. We don't really have them at the drug and device here on campus. The medical personnel might have an initiate a study, or they may go to a sponsor, which would be usually a drug company or a discipline that's following a disease like the Cancer Society. So expedited and exempt are the minimal risk. Expedited generally links to the individual, and exempt is a carve out, if you will, of the federal regulations, that there's certain categories that the federal government says is human subjects research, but it does not need to be followed by the IRB. So it's one and done. Now, since 2018's revised common rule, expedited and exempt have become very, very similar. Still, the difference is the ability to identify your link to participants and their data in the expedited, and in the exempt, if there's no federal funds, we can do that under what we call the flex policy. Generally, on our campus, this is where most of the work is, in the expedited and exempt categories. So again, thinking that the extension, most of your research would probably come under an exemption, because you're going to do focus groups, you do questionnaires, you make observations. So under the federal regulations, there's only certain categories, and they have to be determined by the IRB. The statute does not require that it's the IRB. The university policy decided that it's the IRB, but it cannot be self-reported. And so as a researcher, you may feel very confident that your study is going to be exempt, but it's always prudent to submit it and to receive a document from us that says that is exempt, or it may even be not human subject research. And currently we have 2 students that got ahead of their faculty, and they conducted research without the IRB, and that's because they thought it was exempt. But again, that's for the IRB to determine if it's exempt, and so you don't want to get ahead of the federal regulations, because what will end up is that your data will not be able to be used, and you have to start from scratch. They tend to discover this when they're about ready to be published, so it's always a sad story for the students. But nonetheless, it's a quick response to us. Send us an email, we'll lead you through the application, and you can get it submitted and answer whether it's human subjects research or it's exempt research within just a few days. So the investigator's concern should be the safety of the research participant. The harm to research participants must be avoided. The independence of research must be clear, and any conflict of interest or partiality must be explicit. We don't usually have this problem, though we've had a few that had a conflict of interest, that they were their company and the investigator were the same, and the president of the company, and so we had to put a firewall between the investigator and the research. So informed consent is for competent individuals, so they have to have the capacity to understand and comprehend the informed consent document, and the informed consent process is described in your protocol and in your application, and you will give follow the template that's in IRBNet library, and you can tailor it. It's not word for word for the template. You have to have it to the specifics of your research and what the risk and the conduct of the research would be. So here's kind of a graphic to make it concise. The statement is you're a volunteer. You may stop the research at any time. A summary, you have to give the purpose, duration, and the list of the procedures, reasonable risk or discomforts, any benefits that are expected, or a statement that there's no benefits, and what is an alternative to being in the study, which might be not to be in the study. So this slide reminds us that the 2018 Federal Common Rule revisions really focused in on a concise and focused presentation. So now for long consents, and when I say long, the drug and device consents can be 30 to 40 pages long. And so now we have a face sheet that we call the key information, and it's like having a conversation with the participant. You say in lay terms what the conduct of the study would be, and why they should be in the study, and the flip it, why they not want to be in the study, and you can reference pages on the consent form. So it's not exactly an abstract, it's more like having a dialogue, but it's readily readable and personable to the individual as opposed to the formal legal descriptions in the consent body. So privacy and confidentiality, we have unauthorized invasions of privacy and breaches of confidentiality are disrespectful, and we want clear procedures on how you're protecting their privacy and maintain it through the course of the research. Confidentiality is a duty of all members of the research, and so this is changing as students and faculty are doing more and more research on the web and joining social media groups. It's difficult to 100% guarantee privacy, and so you just need to state that and state the rules of that software, or the SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, Amazon's mTurk. So again, it's bringing it to the participant that there's some things out of the control of the researcher with using online research. So this is a quick reminder that privacy and confidentiality are not the same. Privacy is about people, confidentiality is about data. So what are you going to do to protect the data? Where are you going to store it? How are you going to divulge it to others? And the privacy is having control over the extent and circumstances of someone, and to make sure that they understand what, if you're using videos, if you're using voice in a focus group, that you clearly disclose. So we require training for human subjects research, and when you get these slides, you can see that we have two choices. You can go to our homegrown, which is on the web campus, which we call Thor, Training for Human Research Oversight Responsibilities. And then we also have the national program, which is CITI, which is Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. You do not have to do both, just do one, and they both last for 5 years. So the next slides are kind of how to do it. So first you're going to have to decide if you're doing human subject research. And so here's the definition of human subjects out of the federal regs. So you're looking at intervention or interaction with an individual or their data or tissue. You're going to generate identifiable private information from the data. The intervention includes both physical procedures or manipulation of the subject's environment. The interaction includes communication or interpersonal contact between the investigator and subject. Private information includes information about behavior that occurs in the reasonable expectation of that there would be no observation that you're private, or that you would not be published, such as a medical record. And identifiable private information is information that has the identity of the participant and may be readily ascertained. So after you decide that you're collecting private information, so it can be linked back to the participant, so you're interacting with that person's data. So you have now met the test of human subjects. So now we need to look and see if you're really doing research, because there's other things you could be doing with human subjects. It's not under the definition of research. And so research really is answering a research question so that you have generalizable knowledge. Generalizable knowledge is not defined, but it's really going external. So you could look and improve an evaluation of a program, and it might not be human subjects research. But when you have the intent for it to go externally, to have publishable, generalizable knowledge, then the intent is to answer a research question. So you're going to fall under the statute for human subjects research. So these are examples of what is not research. So oral history, public health surveillance, data collected for the purposes of criminal justice agency or homeland security or defense. Examples of studies that are human subject. I throw this in is, again, internet surveys, studies that involve deception, research about risky behaviors or attitudes, open-ended interviews that contribute to generalizable knowledge. Studies using private information that can be readily linked to the individual, studies that produce generalizable knowledge about categories of subjects from identifiable information, and studies of human beings to evaluate the environment and alterations. So this could be a survey of 4-H children on an event, but when you do a pre-test, education, and post-test, it meets the category of human subjects research. So I'm running out of time really quickly. So you determine if your project is human subjects, and here is a chart that they posted on the government's website. And so you would start with, is it research? And so then you would answer the question that yes, you're gathering in a systematic way for generalizable knowledge. Is the activity research? Does the research involve human subjects? So you say, yes, I'm collecting identifiable data. And so does the research involve intervention or interaction with the individuals? No, just the data. But then it's over, is the information identifiable? And the answer would be yes, so it would be human subjects. So again, when you're not sure, just give me a call and we can walk through it and make an informed decision of hearing what your activity will be and how you're going to interact or engage the person. All that said, I want to also let you know that when you're evaluating a program and you're only, again, it's internal, you want to make the judgments about the program and push it for future program development. That's not human subjects research. But if that same evaluative study that you're doing, you want to publish in a journal or a newspaper article, the line is thin, and so it's probably the most prudent to submitted for IRB review. We always look at intent for faculty, and may work in your design is that you collect surveys for evaluations of a program for 3 years. You collect them and you file them away, and one day you look at them and you realize there's merit to answer a research question. So that's when your intent to do human subject research. So now you need to submit to the IRB, despite the fact that you've had the data for 3 years, but you were doing it for a different purpose, but now your purpose has changed. You want to answer a research question. This is an important website. This is ours, and it has tutorials on our software, IRBNet, with step-by-step guides with images and voiceover. Please use that. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to remind you or tell you that we strongly recommend that you do a protocol, and we have a form in our library for, and this is what it begins to look at. I'm about ready to buy some software where you can, it's called Protocol Builder, and you go in and can pull up saved protocol templates and fill it in and answer your questions, and then print the protocol at the end. So hopefully that'll make it easier for our students and faculty. This is what our cover sheet part 1 looks like, and it's our only smart form, and we're about ready to revise the smart form for a universal IRB application, so you wouldn't have to think, is it exempt, is it social, behavior education, is it biomedical? All you'll be thinking about is, yes, I want to submit to the IRB. So the rest of the slides are some examples of our software where I showed you that website. So I cut and paste a few of those PowerPoint slides, but we do walk you through everything. And again, you can call and we can verbally talk you through. And I will end with my lame picture that I force upon students all the time. Look at the third panel. And so the guy at the top is the co-investigator. The guy at the bottom with the rock notebook is the principal investigator. The guy sitting down is the participant. And the IRB is that very flimsy umbrella. So who's going to protect the participant from that boulder? Would it be the investigator or that flimsy IRB umbrella? Yes, it's the safety is the participant from the co-investigator or the principal investigator. We're a committee, we find out things after the fact. We can guide and build the safety of the presentation of and conduct of the study, but in the end, it's the ethical investigator. That's it.
Thank you. So if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat pod, which I'm monitoring.
Danny, I have a couple questions. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you could speak up a little bit, Annie, that would be very helpful. Okay. Or get closer to your mic.
So I have 3 questions, but they're short, so I don't know if we want to ask them all at once. One is, they talk about the Qualtrics, having the confidentiality is kind of outside the researcher's control. That's, I never really thought about that. Does that mean that you don't really recommend it? That's one question. The second one is if you could discuss really the difference between CITI and SOAR in terms of when you would use or encourage one over the other one. And the last one is about exempt versus expedited. They're very similar, you said, since 2018, but how do they play out differently when you actually get one over the other one? So
Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey, we have license for and we use. One thing here is a slide that I kind of left up as an example if you were doing Qualtrics, or this one actually was for MTurk. But you say in that in this case that Amazon can link the data to the worker, and that you may make sure that you're using a secure system to collect the data, but we can't completely eliminate this risk. So again, when you have a situation that you're doing an online survey with Qualtrics, generally they have a face page, so that's the informed consent or the equivalent of an informed consent, and there you want to say that you will protect the privacy to the best of your ability, but with it being online, you cannot eliminate all the risk. Sometimes they recommend that people delete cookies, and so hopefully that has answered that question on Qualtrics. So is there anything else on Qualtrics?
No, that was, thank you.
And I've already forgot the second question now, but
about CITI versus Thor.
Oh, you know, I don't know. So we created Thor back when City was really cumbersome and very long. You know, they would ask the question, what color is the white horse on page 11? And so we got a lot of pushback from students. And so I cleverly thought, well, let's give them a choice. And so Thor, we originally was to take less time, and you have the choice of doing the PowerPoint with a voiceover, or doing the PowerPoint with no voice, or going directly to the quiz. City was not like that, but now they've kind of streamlined the City, so they're very, very similar. Maybe Thor is a little bit lighter with time duration.
Either one is valid for
Yes.
any research study.
Yes, that's true.
Okay.
And then the difference between expedited and exempt, for your practical purposes, there, it really comes down to federal funding or not. So if there's no federal funding and you want to create a research study that you're going to link to the individuals, we could do it as an exempt if there's no federal funds. So what's the difference? Well, I can't really say that there's much difference now since 2018, because we asked for a progress report. We no longer use the term renewable, so you don't expire on either one, but we're going to ask you once a year if you're still doing the study and give us a progress report. The form right now is much simpler, but we're going to collapse all of our forms together, and so you'll have the same questions, but you'll skip over. So I really, as I sit here, cannot say to the investigator what's the advantage of doing the exempt or the expedited. The other is, right now, if you do an exempt and you don't meet the criteria, but you've given us enough information, we don't ask for another form. We'll just go in and make our judgment that it meets the criteria of expedited, not exempt. The other way is if you do a full board study and it turns out to be exempt, the fact that you use the wrong form, as long as the information's there, we'll make our judgment and send you an approval letter. So we really try to be user-friendly. We know that you're not the experts of the federal regulations. We try to be, and we try to guide you through the least burden that you could have.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to say to you, to everybody, that Nancy has always been amazing to our staff, and us being far away, a lot of people being far away, whether you're Jill out in Elko or us down here. Nancy and her team have always been super helpful, and I really appreciate the work you guys do and how easily accessible you are to folks.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Nancy? There are none in the chat pod at this point in time. Okay, hearing none. Thank you so much, Nancy, for your presentation. It was extremely informative. And if anyone has questions, feel free to email Nancy. Thank you, Nancy.